Patricia Holloway sat perfectly still in the worn wooden chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, as the morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Courtroom 4B. The familiar scent of old paper and furniture polish filled the air as lawyers shuffled documents and whispered urgently to their clients. She had chosen a simple navy dress for today, one that spoke of dignity rather than wealth, though the irony of that choice would soon become devastatingly clear to everyone present. Across the aisle, her husband of 15 years, Richard Holloway, leaned back in his chair with the casual confidence of a man who believed victory was already his. His tailored Italian suit probably cost more than most people made in a month, and he wore it like armor against any doubt that might creep into his mind. Beside him sat his legal team, 3 attorneys from the most expensive firm in the city, their briefcases stuffed with documents that painted Patricia as nothing more than a dependent housewife who had contributed little to their marriage beyond keeping house and looking presentable at business functions. Behind Richard, in the gallery section reserved for observers, sat Veronica Chun, the 20-year-old marketing consultant who had been sharing Richard's bed for the past 8 months. Her red designer dress and perfectly styled hair announced her presence like a victory flag, and she made no effort to hide her smug satisfaction as she watched the proceedings unfold. Every few minutes, she would lean forward to whisper something in Richard's ear, causing him to chuckle softly and nod with the assured manner of a man who knew exactly how this day would end. I wonder where you're watching this from today. Whether you're in a courtroom yourself or at home thinking about justice delayed, there's something universal about watching arrogance meet its match. Drop a comment and let me know what state or country you're tuning in from, because this story about hidden truths is going to unfold in ways that might hit closer to home than you expect. Judge Margaret Chun, no relation to the woman in the gallery despite sharing her surname, called the court to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. The sound echoed through the chamber like gunshots, but Patricia didn't flinch. She had been preparing for this moment longer than anyone in the room could possibly imagine, though her preparation had taken forms that would have surprised them all. Richard's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Marcus Webb who charged $800 an hour, rose to address the court with the practiced ease of someone who had dismantled dozens of marriages for wealthy clients. His opening statement painted Patricia as the classic story of a woman who had married above her station and now sought to profit from her husband's hard work and business acumen. "Your Honor," Webb began, his voice carrying the authority that came with decades of courtroom victories, "my client Richard Holloway built a successful consulting firm from nothing more than ambition and determination. For 15 years, he supported his wife Patricia in a lifestyle that allowed her to focus on domestic pursuits while he generated the income that funded their comfortable existence. Mrs. Holloway never worked outside the home, never contributed to the business ventures that created their wealth, and never demonstrated any understanding of the complex financial decisions that built their assets." Patricia listened to these words without expression, though something flickered behind her calm brown eyes that might have been amusement if anyone had been paying close enough attention. Her own attorney, a quiet woman in her 50s named Sarah Morrison who worked from a modest office downtown, sat beside her taking careful notes in a leather-bound notebook. Sarah's fees were reasonable, her clothes were practical rather than expensive, and everything about her suggested a lawyer who handled middle-class divorces rather than high-stakes financial battles. Webb continued his presentation, producing photographs of the Holloway mansion in the exclusive Riverside Heights neighborhood, complete with its swimming pool, tennis court, and 3-car garage housing Richard's collection of luxury vehicles. He showed the court documentation of their country club membership, their annual vacations to European destinations, and the expensive jewelry that Richard had bought for Patricia over the years. This lifestyle was created entirely through Mr. Holloway's business success, Webb declared, gesturing toward a chart that showed Richard's consulting firm's impressive revenue growth over the past decade. Mrs. Holloway enjoyed the benefits of this success without contributing to its creation. She has never held employment during their marriage, has no business experience, and has demonstrated no financial acumen whatsoever. Her request for 50% of the marital assets represents nothing more than an attempt to profit from work she never performed and success she never helped create. From the gallery, Veronica couldn't suppress a small laugh at this characterization. She covered it quickly with her hand, but not before several people in the courtroom noticed. Her satisfaction was palpable as she imagined Richard's assets being protected from what she clearly viewed as Patricia's grasping attempt to claim money she hadn't earned. After all, Veronica had plans for that money, and Richard had made promises about their future together that depended on keeping his wealth intact. Richard himself nodded approvingly as his lawyer spoke, occasionally making notes on a legal pad or whispering brief comments to Webb. His confidence was absolute, built on 15 years of believing he understood exactly who he had married and what she was capable of. Patricia had always been quiet about her background before their marriage, and Richard had interpreted that quietness as evidence that there simply wasn't much to discuss. A small-town girl from modest circumstances who had been lucky enough to catch the attention of an ambitious man on his way up in the world. Judge Chun listened to Webb's presentation with the neutral expression that experienced judges cultivated over years of hearing similar arguments. She had presided over hundreds of divorce cases and knew that the truth often lay somewhere between the extremes that opposing attorneys presented. Still, the evidence seemed straightforward enough. Richard appeared to be a successful businessman seeking to protect assets he had legitimately earned, while Patricia seemed to be a non-working spouse hoping to claim a substantial settlement. Webb's presentation included financial records showing Richard's consulting firm generating millions in revenue, contracts with major corporations, and evidence of Richard's reputation as a sought-after business strategist. Everything painted the picture of a self-made man who had built something substantial through his own efforts and intelligence. Mrs. Holloway has lived a life of leisure funded by my client's hard work, Webb concluded, his voice taking on the tone of righteous indignation that wealthy men's lawyers perfected when discussing their clients' soon-to-be wives. She has never held a job, never started a business, never made an investment decision, and never demonstrated any capability beyond spending the money that Mr. Holloway earned. To award her 50% of assets she had no role in creating would be a grave injustice and a dangerous precedent for hard-working entrepreneurs who seek to build something lasting. The courtroom murmured with approval from Richard's side of the gallery. Several of his business associates had come to watch the proceedings, confident that their friend and colleague would emerge victorious. They saw Patricia as they had always seen her, a pleasant but unremarkable woman who had been fortunate enough to marry well and was now attempting to capitalize on that good fortune. Patricia remained motionless throughout Webb's presentation, her expression never changing from its mask of calm attention. She didn't take notes, didn't whisper to her attorney, and didn't show any visible reaction to being characterized as a gold digger who had contributed nothing to her marriage. Sarah Morrison occasionally glanced at her client, perhaps wondering why Patricia seemed so unconcerned about the devastating picture being painted of her character and contributions. But those who knew how to look might have noticed something in Patricia's stillness that went beyond mere composure. There was a quality to her attention that suggested someone listening carefully to lies she had expected to hear, someone who possessed knowledge that would soon transform every assumption being made in that courtroom. Her hands remained folded in her lap, but there was nothing nervous or defeated about her posture. Instead, she sat like someone who was waiting for exactly the right moment to reveal a truth that would change everything. When Webb finally concluded his opening statement and returned to his seat beside Richard, the atmosphere in the courtroom felt charged with anticipation. Richard's victory seemed so assured that even Judge Chun appeared to be considering how quickly she could rule in his favor and move on to the next case on her crowded docket. But Patricia Holloway continued to sit in perfect stillness, and those few observers who bothered to really look at her might have wondered why a woman facing such devastating accusations seemed so remarkably, mysteriously calm. Judge Chun nodded towards Sarah Morrison, indicating it was time for Patricia's attorney to present her case. Sarah rose slowly, her modest black suit a stark contrast to the expensive tailoring displayed by Richard's legal team. She carried a single manila folder to the podium, its thin profile suggesting either supreme confidence or complete lack of preparation. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice steady but lacking the theatrical flair that Webb had employed, "my client Patricia Holloway seeks only what is fair and legally hers under the laws governing marital property." While Mr. Webb has painted an impressive picture of his client's business success, We believe the court will find that the reality of this marriage and its financial foundations is far more complex than has been presented. Richard leaned back in his chair with an expression that bordered on amusement. He whispered something to Webb, who responded with a barely concealed smirk. From her position in the gallery, Veronica made no effort to hide her eye roll at what she clearly viewed as a desperate attempt by Patricia's outmatched attorney to create drama where none existed. Webb had prepared for this moment carefully, and as Sarah concluded her brief opening remarks, he was ready with his evidence presentation. He stood and approached the evidence table, where his assistants had arranged a carefully curated display of Richard's success story. "Your Honor, if I may direct the court's attention to Exhibit A," Webb announced, gesturing toward a series of photographs mounted on foam boards. These images document the lifestyle that Mr. Holloway provided for his wife throughout their marriage. The residence alone, purchased in 2018, cost $2.8 million and sits on 4 acres in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. The photographs were indeed impressive. The sprawling Tudor-style mansion featured soaring ceilings, imported marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered stunning views of the river valley below. The kitchen showcased commercial-grade appliances and custom cabinetry that probably cost more than most people's entire homes. The master bedroom suite was larger than many apartments, complete with a sitting area, fireplace, and Hisender's walk-in closets that resembled luxury boutiques. Webb moved through the evidence systematically, each item designed to emphasize the vast difference between Richard's earning capacity and Patricia's apparent lack of contribution. Exhibit B showed the 3 luxury vehicles in their garage: Richard's Mercedes S-Class, his weekend Porsche 911, and the BMW SUV that Patricia drove to her various social engagements and charity luncheons. Mrs. Holloway's daily activities, Webb explained to the court, consisted primarily of shopping, lunching with other wives from their social circle, and attending charity galas where she wore gowns that cost thousands of dollars each. She never held employment, never generated income, and never demonstrated any interest in or aptitude for the business activities that funded her comfortable lifestyle. Veronica couldn't suppress a quiet laugh at this description, though she quickly covered her mouth when Judge Chin glanced in her direction. The sound was audible enough that several people in the courtroom turned to look at her, including Patricia, who regarded the younger woman with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the proceedings. Richard's confidence grew with each piece of evidence his lawyer presented. Webb showed the court documentation of Richard's consulting firm, Holloway Strategic Solutions, which had grown from a one-man operation to a company employing 37 people and generating annual revenues exceeding $15 million. The client list read like a who's who of major corporations, and testimonial letters praised Richard's innovative approaches to organizational efficiency and strategic planning. "My client built this success through 70-hour work weeks, countless business trips, and the kind of dedicated focus that true entrepreneurs understand," Webb declared, his voice rising with practiced indignation. While he was working until midnight analyzing market trends and developing strategic solutions for Fortune 500 companies, Mrs. Holloway was attending yoga classes and planning dinner parties for their social circle. The characterization stung, but not in the way Webb intended. Several of Richard's friends in the gallery nodded approvingly, remembering the countless evenings when Richard had worked late while Patricia handled the domestic sphere of their lives. What they didn't know, what none of them could have guessed, was that Patricia's yoga classes were actually cover for much more substantial activities, and her dinner parties had served purposes that went far beyond simple social entertainment. Webb presented Exhibit D, a detailed financial analysis prepared by a certified public accountant who specialized in high-net-worth divorce cases. The analysis traced every major asset in the Holloway portfolio back to income generated by Richard's business activities. The house, the cars, the investment accounts, the retirement funds, even Patricia's substantial jewelry collection, everything could be directly linked to Richard's earnings over the past 15 years. This analysis proves definitively that Mrs. Holloway brought no financial assets to the marriage and contributed no income during the marriage, Webb announced, pointing to charts and graphs that painted Patricia as a woman who had lived entirely off her husband's success. She has been, in economic terms, a dependent rather than a partner. The words hit Patricia's supporters in the courtroom like physical blows, though Patricia herself seemed unaffected. Her sister Elena, who had driven up from the state capitol to attend the hearing, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but noticed that Patricia's expression hadn't changed. If anything, Patricia appeared to be listening with the kind of focused attention someone might give to a moderately interesting lecture on a topic they already understood completely. Richard turned slightly in his chair to catch Veronica's eye, and she rewarded him with a brilliant smile that promised celebrations to come. They had discussed their plans extensively over the past few months, including which of Patricia's jewelry pieces Veronica would like to keep and how quickly they could redecorate the house to better suit her tastes. Richard had assured her that Patricia would receive only the minimum alimony required by law, leaving the bulk of their assets free for their new life together. Webb's presentation grew more detailed as he moved through business records that showed Richard's progression from a junior consultant earning modest fees to the owner of a thriving firm that commanded premium rates for its services. Client testimonials praised his innovative thinking and strategic vision, while financial records showed steady growth year after year. Mrs. Holloway, meanwhile, has no employment history beyond a brief stint as a bank teller more than 16 years ago, Webb continued, consulting notes that made Patricia's pre-marriage life sound barely more substantial than a footnote. She has no advanced degrees, no professional certifications, and no business experience whatsoever. Her contributions to this marriage have been limited to the domestic sphere, which, while valuable in its own way, does not justify a claim to 50% of assets she had no role in creating. The domestic sphere comment drew chuckles from Richard's business associates, who had always viewed Patricia as exactly the kind of trophy wife that successful men were entitled to acquire once they reached a certain level of achievement. She was pleasant enough, certainly attractive in an understated way, and she had always known how to dress appropriately for business functions and charity events. But the idea that someone with her background could have contributed meaningfully to Richard's financial success struck them as almost laughably naive. Judge Chun took notes throughout Webb's presentation, occasionally asking for clarification on specific financial details or requesting to examine particular documents more closely. Her questions suggested a thorough understanding of complex financial arrangements, but nothing in her demeanor indicated surprise or skepticism about the narrative being presented. Webb concluded his evidence presentation with a flourish, producing a thick binder containing what he described as a complete financial history of the Holloway marriage. Every bank statement, every investment record, every major purchase was documented and traced back to Richard's business income. The message was clear and seemingly irrefutable. Richard had earned everything. Patricia had contributed nothing, and any substantial settlement would constitute an unfair transfer of wealth from a productive individual to someone who had simply been fortunate enough to marry well. As Webb returned to his seat beside Richard, the atmosphere in the courtroom felt charged with the confidence of impending victory. Richard's legal team exchanged satisfied glances, while Veronica practically glowed with anticipation. Even some of the court staff seemed impressed by the thoroughness of the presentation and the clarity of the financial evidence. Patricia continued to sit in perfect stillness, her hands still folded in her lap, her expression unchanged from its mask of calm attention. Sarah Morrison had taken extensive notes during Webb's presentation, but she hadn't raised any objections or challenged any of the evidence being presented. To outside observers, it looked like a case where the outcome was so obvious that even the opposing attorney was going through the motions without much hope of success. But those who watched Patricia carefully might have noticed something subtle in her demeanor during the most damaging portions of Webb's presentation. When he described her as having no business experience, a tiny smile seemed to flicker at the corners of her mouth. When he characterized her background as unremarkable and her contributions as purely domestic, she tilted her head slightly, like someone hearing a particularly creative interpretation of events she remembered quite differently. The morning sun had shifted position during Webb's lengthy presentation, and now it fell directly across Patricia's face, illuminating features that suggested strength rather than defeat. Her stillness was not the paralysis of someone overwhelmed by superior legal firepower, but the composure of someone who knew exactly what cards she held and was simply waiting for the proper moment to play them. Richard turned in his chair one more time to smile at Veronica, and she responded with a look of such triumph that several people in the gallery noticed. Their future seemed not just secure but golden, built on the foundation of Richard's proven success and protected by legal arguments that appeared unassailable. In just a few more hours, they believed, this ordeal would be over and their real life together could finally begin. Judge Chen glanced at the clock on the courtroom wall and then looked towards Sarah Morrison. The time had come for Patricia's side to present their case, though after Webb's devastating presentation, it seemed more like a formality than a real contest. Whatever Patricia's attorney had in that thin manila folder, it would need to be extraordinary to overcome the mountain of evidence that had just been presented against her client. Judge Chun turned her attention to Patricia's side of the courtroom with the weary expression of someone who had sat through enough divorce proceedings to recognize when one side was hopelessly outmatched. The evidence presented by Richard's team had been comprehensive, well-organized, and seemingly definitive. Now it was time to hear what Patricia's modest attorney could offer in response to such an overwhelming case. Sarah Morrison rose from her chair with deliberate slowness, her movements suggesting careful consideration rather than defeat. She approached the podium carrying her thin manila folder, but instead of opening it immediately, she stood quietly for a moment, looking directly at Judge Chun with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice carrying a different quality than it had during her opening remarks. "Before I present my client's evidence, I would like to request permission to submit some additional documentation that has recently come to my attention. I understand this is somewhat irregular, but I believe these materials are crucial to the court's understanding of the true financial picture of this marriage." The request was simple enough, but something about the way Sarah delivered it caused a ripple of unease through Richard's side of the courtroom. Webb frowned and leaned forward in his chair, suddenly alert in a way he hadn't been moments before. Richard himself felt a small flutter of concern, though he couldn't identify exactly what had triggered it. "What type of documentation are you referring to, Ms. Morrison?" Judge Chen asked, her tone neutral but curious. "Financial records, Your Honor. International banking documents and investment portfolios that my client has maintained independently throughout the marriage." Sarah's voice remained steady, but there was a new authority in it that hadn't been present before. Veronica stopped examining her perfectly manicured nails and focused on the proceedings for the first time since the morning had begun. Something in the attorney's tone suggested this wasn't going to be the quick capitulation she had been expecting. She glanced at Richard, who was now sitting straighter in his chair, his earlier confidence replaced by something that looked suspiciously like concern. Webb stood immediately, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a lawyer who sensed an ambush developing. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Discovery was completed months ago, and opposing counsel has had ample opportunity to present any relevant financial documentation. If Mrs. Holloway had independent assets, they should have been disclosed during the standard financial discovery process." Sarah Morrison turned to face Webb directly, and for the first time all morning, she smiled. The expression transformed her entire appearance, revealing a sharp intelligence that her modest demeanor had previously concealed. "I understand Mr. Webb's concern, but these particular assets were held in structures that required specialized disclosure procedures under international banking laws. My client has been working with federal authorities to ensure proper documentation, and those procedures were only recently completed." The word federal hit the courtroom like a small explosion. Richard's business associates began whispering among themselves, while Veronica's confident smile faltered entirely. Federal authorities meant serious money, the kind that came with oversight and regulation that small-time wealthy people never encountered. Richard turned to Webb with an expression that demanded explanation, but Webb looked equally confused. His extensive preparation for this case had uncovered no hint of international banking relationships or federal involvement in Patricia's finances. The discovery process had revealed exactly what he expected, a woman with no significant assets beyond what her husband had provided. Judge Chun considered the request carefully, her experienced eye noting the sudden shift in courtroom dynamics. Patricia's attorney was no longer the overwhelmed small-town lawyer she had appeared to be just moments earlier. Instead, she was beginning to resemble someone who had been deliberately understating her capabilities for strategic reasons. Ms. Morrison, Judge Chun said finally, I will allow you to present these additional documents, but I expect a full explanation of why they were not included in the original discovery submissions. Thank you, Your Honor. Sarah opened her manila folder for the first time, revealing not the few scattered papers that its thin profile had suggested, but a carefully organized collection of documents that had been compressed and arranged with mathematical precision. Patricia spoke for the first time since the proceedings had begun, her voice cutting through the courtroom with startling clarity and authority. Your Honor, if I may address the court directly regarding these documents. The sound of Patricia's voice caused every head in the courtroom to turn. Gone was the quiet, almost apologetic tone that everyone expected from a woman who had just been systematically destroyed by opposing counsel. Instead, her words carried the kind of confidence that came from absolute certainty about facts that others didn't yet understand. Richard stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. In 15 years of marriage, he had never heard Patricia speak with such command and authority. She had always been soft-spoken, deferential, content to let him take the lead in any situation that required assertiveness or expertise. This version of Patricia was entirely unfamiliar to him. Of course, Mrs. Holloway, Judge Chun replied, clearly intrigued by the dramatic change in the woman who had sat silently through hours of character assassination. Patricia rose from her chair with fluid grace, smoothing her simple navy dress as she approached the witness stand. Her movement was economical and precise, lacking any trace of the uncertainty or nervousness that might be expected from someone about to address a court for the first time. Your Honor, Patricia began, her voice carrying easily to every corner of the courtroom. The documents that my attorney is about to present will show that Mr. Webb's characterization of our marriage's financial structure is based on incomplete information. While it is true that my husband's consulting business has been successful, it represents only a small portion of the total assets and income streams that have supported our lifestyle over the past 15 years. Webb shot to his feet, objection forming on his lips, but Patricia continued before he could speak, her timing suggesting someone who understood courtroom procedure far better than her background had indicated. These documents will demonstrate that I have maintained independent financial relationships with institutions in Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and Singapore throughout our marriage. The assets in question predate our wedding by several years and have grown substantially through active management and strategic reinvestment. The courtroom fell into absolute silence except for the sound of Richard's sharp intake of breath. Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, and Singapore were not places where small-town bank tellers typically maintained accounts. These were the financial centers where serious international wealth was managed and protected. Veronica's face had gone pale as she processed the implications of what Patricia was saying. If Patricia had independent assets significant enough to require international banking relationships, then everything about their future plans would need to be reconsidered. Richard's wealth, which had seemed so substantial just minutes earlier, might be nothing compared to resources that Patricia had kept hidden throughout their marriage. Webb finally found his voice, though it carried none of the authority that had characterized his earlier presentations. Your Honor, I must object to this entire line of testimony. If Mrs. Holloway possessed substantial independent assets, the failure to disclose them during discovery represents a serious violation of court procedures. Patricia turned to look directly at Webb, and her smile was patient in the way that experts showed when addressing someone who had missed an important detail. Mr. Webb, the assets in question were properly disclosed to all relevant authorities as required by federal law. However, the disclosure requirements for international holdings in domestic divorce proceedings are quite complex, and my attorney has been working with federal banking regulators to ensure full compliance with all applicable statutes. Judge Chin leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued by the mention of federal banking regulators. Mrs. Holloway, are you saying that your financial holdings required federal oversight during this divorce proceeding? Yes, Your Honor. Patricia's answer was delivered with the calm certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. When international assets exceed certain thresholds, federal authorities must verify that all domestic legal proceedings comply with international banking agreements and tax treaties. This verification process was completed last week, which is why we can now present complete documentation to the court. Richard felt the first real stab of fear he had experienced since filing for divorce. Federal thresholds for international banking oversight were measured in millions, not thousands. If Patricia was telling the truth, then his understanding of their financial situation was not just incomplete, but fundamentally wrong. The business associates who had come to watch Richard's easy victory began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They had known Patricia for years as Richard's quiet, unassuming wife who smiled pleasantly at dinner parties and asked appropriate questions about their golf games and vacation plans. The idea that this same woman had been managing international investment portfolios while appearing to live as a dependent housewife was almost impossible to process. "Your Honor," Patricia continued, her voice gaining strength with each word, "I request that the court examine the complete financial documentation that my attorney is prepared to present. I believe you will find that the true financial picture of our marriage is significantly different from what Mr. Webb has suggested." Judge Chun nodded slowly, her experienced instincts telling her that the case she thought she understood was about to become something entirely different. "Very well, Mrs. Holloway. Please return to your seat, and Ms. Morrison, you may proceed with your document presentation." As Patricia walked back to her chair, every eye in the courtroom followed her movement. The woman who had seemed so defeated just minutes earlier now moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen and was completely prepared for it. Richard turned to Webb with desperate urgency, whispering frantically about how this could be possible and what it meant for their case. Webb could only shake his head, equally confused by developments that had taken him completely by surprise. Veronica sat frozen in her seat, her earlier triumph replaced by growing dread as she began to understand that everything she thought she knew about Richard's wealth and their future together might be built on assumptions that were about to be proven spectacularly wrong. Sarah Morrison approached the evidence table with documents that suddenly seemed far more significant than anyone had imagined. The thin manila folder had been deceptive in the same way that Patricia's modest appearance had been misleading. Both had concealed depths that were about to transform every assumption that had been made in this courtroom. The atmosphere had shifted completely from Richard's confident victory march to something that felt dangerous and unpredictable. For the first time since the proceedings had begun, Patricia looked like someone who held cards that others couldn't see, and the game that Richard thought he was winning was about to reveal rules that he had never understood. Sarah Morrison approached the document projector with the deliberate movements of someone who had been planning this moment for months. The first document she placed on the glass surface appeared to be a simple bank statement, but as the image filled the large screen visible to everyone in the courtroom, the letterhead drew gasps from several observers. Credit Suisse Private Banking, Zurich. The account holder was listed as Patricia Elena Holloway, and the statement was dated just 3 weeks earlier. But it was the account balance that caused Veronica to grip her seat and Richard to feel the blood drain from his face. The figure displayed was not in thousands or even hundreds of thousands, but showed a balance of 12,847,592. 33 Swiss francs. "Your Honor," Sarah announced calmly, "this represents just one of several accounts that my client has maintained independently throughout her marriage. As you can see, the account shows consistent activity over the past 15 years, including regular deposits, strategic withdrawals, and substantial growth through active portfolio management." Webb lurched to his feet, his earlier composure completely shattered. "Your Honor, this has to be some kind of mistake or fabrication. There is absolutely no way that Mrs. Holloway could have maintained assets of this magnitude without our knowledge during the discovery process." Sarah turned to face Webb with an expression of patient professionalism. "Mr. Webb, I understand your surprise, but these documents have been verified by federal banking authorities as part of the international disclosure process I mentioned earlier. If you would like to examine the authentication stamps and federal verification codes, I would be happy to provide them." Judge Chen leaned forward to study the projection more carefully. "Ms. Morrison, can you explain to the court how your client acquired these assets and why they were not disclosed during standard discovery procedures?" "Certainly, Your Honor." Sarah placed a second document on the projector, this one showing what appeared to be a trust document with legal seals and signatures from multiple law firms. Mrs. Holloway inherited substantial assets from her late grandfather's estate when she turned 25, approximately 2 years before her marriage to Mr. Holloway. These assets were placed in international trust structures to protect them from domestic legal complications and to comply with specific requirements of her grandfather's will. Richard stared at the screen in complete bewilderment. Patricia had never mentioned a grandfather with substantial wealth, never talked about inheritance, and certainly never indicated that she had access to millions in international accounts. He tried to remember conversations from their early dating period, searching for any hint of the financial background that was now being revealed. The trust document showed Patricia as the sole beneficiary of something called the Elena Morrison Family Trust, established in 1998 with initial assets exceeding $8 million. The document indicated that Patricia had gained full control of the trust assets on her 25th birthday, which Richard now realized had been just months before they started dating seriously. Sarah continued her presentation by placing a third document on the projector, this one from HSBC Singapore, showing another account in Patricia's name with a current balance exceeding $4 million. Your Honor, my client has been actively managing these inherited assets throughout her marriage, using her background in international finance to grow the original inheritance substantially. Background in international finance. The words hit Richard like physical blows. He turned to stare at Patricia, who met his gaze with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the proceedings, but now he could see something in her eyes that he had somehow missed for 15 years. There was an intelligence there, a depth of knowledge and capability that made him realize he had never really known the woman he had married. Veronica felt sick as she watched more documents appear on the screen. Each one showed Patricia's name associated with financial institutions that most people had only heard of in movies about international espionage. The Cayman Islands account showed a balance of over $6 million, while documents from a London-based investment firm indicated that Patricia held substantial positions in European markets that had performed exceptionally well over the past decade. But it was the fourth document that truly shattered Richard's worldview. Sarah placed what appeared to be a university transcript on the projector, and Richard found himself looking at Patricia's educational credentials for the first time in their 15-year relationship. The transcript was from the Wharton School of Business, University of Pennsylvania, and it showed that Patricia had graduated summa cum laude with a master's degree in international finance, with particular emphasis on offshore banking regulations and international investment structures. Webb looked at the transcript with the expression of a man watching his entire case collapse in real time. Your Honor, he managed to say, even if these documents are authentic, the failure to disclose these assets and this educational background during discovery represents a massive violation of court procedures. Patricia rose from her chair without being asked, her movement fluid and confident. Your Honor, if I may respond to Mr. Webb's concerns directly. Judge Chin nodded, clearly fascinated by the dramatic transformation taking place in her courtroom. Mr. Webb is correct that these assets were not included in standard divorce discovery submissions, Patricia began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood complex legal procedures. However, international assets held in trust structures are subject to federal disclosure requirements that supersede state divorce proceedings. My attorney has been working with the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network to ensure that all federal requirements were met before these assets could be properly disclosed in domestic court. The mention of the Treasury Department sent another wave of shock through Richard's supporters in the gallery. FinCEN was not an agency that dealt with typical divorce settlements. Their involvement suggested financial complexity that went far beyond what anyone in the courtroom had imagined possible. Patricia continued, her explanation delivered with the precision of someone who had clearly dealt with these regulations before. Under federal law, international assets exceeding certain thresholds must be reported to multiple agencies when they become involved in domestic legal proceedings. The verification process includes background checks, source of funds documentation, and compliance reviews that can take several months to complete. Richard felt as if he were watching a stranger who happened to look like his wife. The Patricia he thought he knew could barely balance their household checkbook and had never shown any interest in their investment accounts beyond asking occasionally whether they had enough money for vacation plans. This Patricia was discussing federal financial regulations with the fluency of someone who had spent years navigating international banking laws. Sarah placed another document on the projector, this one showing what appeared to be a business license from the state of Delaware. The document indicated that Patricia was the sole owner of something called Meridian International Consulting, LLC, a company that had been providing financial advisory services to high-net-worth individuals for the past 12 years. Your Honor, Sarah explained, my client has been operating a successful consulting business throughout her marriage, specializing in international asset protection and offshore investment strategies. Her clients include several Fortune 500 executives and family offices that require discretion and expertise in complex financial structures. The revelation that Patricia had been running her own business while appearing to be nothing more than a housewife was almost too much for Richard to process. He thought about all the days when she had left the house for what he assumed were shopping trips or social activities. All the evenings when she had worked on what he thought were charity planning committees. All the phone calls she had taken in their home office that he had assumed were related to household management. Veronica realized that every assumption she had made about her future with Richard was built on a foundation that was crumbling before her eyes. If Patricia owned millions in international assets and operated a successful consulting business, then Richard's wealth was insignificant by comparison. The lifestyle she had been planning, the security she thought she had found with Richard, all of it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who held the real power in the Holloway marriage. Judge Chin studied the business documents carefully. Ms. Morrison, are you saying that your client has been earning substantial income from this consulting business throughout her marriage? Yes, Your Honor. Sarah placed a final document on the projector, this one showing tax returns for Meridian International Consulting that indicated annual revenues ranging from $800,000 to $2 million over the past 5 years. My client has been paying all applicable federal and state taxes on this income, but the nature of her business requires significant discretion, which is why many people in her personal life were unaware of her professional activities. Richard stared at the tax returns with the expression of a man whose entire understanding of reality had just been proven false. Patricia had been earning more from her consulting business than his firm generated in profit, and she had been doing it while maintaining the appearance of someone who spent her days attending charity luncheons and managing their household. The courtroom had fallen into stunned silence as observers processed what they were witnessing. Patricia's sister Elena, who had known about some of Patricia's financial sophistication, was nevertheless shocked by the full extent of what was being revealed. Even she had not understood the true scope of Patricia's business success or the magnitude of her international assets. Webb made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. Your Honor, even if we accept that these documents are authentic, the fact remains that Mr. Holloway was completely unaware of his wife's business activities and international assets. This suggests deception on Mrs. Holloway's part that raises serious questions about the validity of their marriage and her claims to marital property. Patricia turned to look at Webb with an expression that could only be described as pitying. Mr. Webb, she said quietly, there was no deception involved. Your client never asked about my professional background, never inquired about my income sources, and never showed any interest in my family history or educational credentials. The fact that he chose not to learn these basic facts about the woman he married does not constitute deception on my part. The simple truth of Patricia's words hit Richard like a sledgehammer. She was right. He had never asked about her previous work experience beyond the bank teller job he had somehow learned about. He had never inquired about her family background beyond knowing her parents had died when she was young. He had never shown any interest in her education or her capabilities beyond what directly affected his own comfort and social standing. Judge Chun looked from the documents on the screen to Patricia, then to Richard, and finally to the stack of additional papers that Sarah Morrison had yet to present. The case that had seemed straightforward just an hour earlier had become something entirely different, and it was clear that the revelations were far from over. Ms. Morrison, Judge Chun said finally, I believe you mentioned that there were additional documents to present. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah replied, her smile suggesting that the most shocking revelations were still to come. What we have shown so far represents my client's independent assets and income. Now I would like to present documentation regarding the actual sources of funding for the lifestyle that Mr. Webb attributed entirely to his client's business success. Richard felt the last of his confidence evaporate as he realized that Patricia's attorney was just getting started, and everything he thought he knew about his marriage, his success, and his future was about to be revealed as an illusion built on assumptions he should never have made. Sarah Morrison's next document placement on the projector created absolute silence in the courtroom. What appeared on the screen was a property deed for the Holloway mansion in Riverside Heights, but the name listed as the sole owner was not Richard Holloway or even both spouses jointly. The deed clearly showed Patricia Elena Holloway as the exclusive owner, with a purchase date of June 15, 2018, and a purchase price of $2.8 million paid in full with no mortgage. "Your Honor," Sarah announced, her voice carrying across the stunned courtroom, "this deed shows that my client purchased the family residence using funds transferred from her Swiss accounts. Mr. Holloway was added to the deed as a courtesy for tax purposes, but he was removed as an owner when he filed for divorce, as was his right under the prenuptial agreement he signed." Webb shot to his feet so quickly that his chair rolled backward. "Prenuptial agreement? Your Honor, there was no prenuptial agreement disclosed in discovery. This is another fundamental violation of procedure." Patricia rose gracefully from her chair, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Your Honor, if I may clarify the situation regarding our prenuptial agreement." Judge Chen nodded, her fascination with the unfolding drama clearly evident. The case had moved so far beyond standard divorce proceedings that she was no longer thinking about her schedule, but about the legal complexity being revealed. "Mr. Webb is partially correct that a standard prenuptial agreement was not filed with our marriage documents," Patricia explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood exactly what she was discussing. "However, we did execute what is known as a post-nuptial asset protection agreement 18 months after our wedding, when my international holdings required additional legal protection under new federal regulations." Sarah placed another document on the projector, this one bearing official legal seals and signatures from multiple attorneys. The document was titled Post-Nuptial Asset Protection and Inheritance Preservation Agreement, and it was 37 pages of dense legal language that clearly delineated which assets belonged to whom in the Holloway marriage. "Your Honor," Patricia continued, "this agreement was executed with full legal representation for both parties, though I paid for both legal teams to ensure that my husband received proper counsel. The agreement specifically protects assets that either party brought to the marriage or inherited during the marriage, while establishing joint ownership only for assets that were genuinely acquired through joint efforts." Richard stared at the document with growing horror as he began to remember signing something complex and legal several years into their marriage. Patricia had presented it as a routine update to their estate planning, necessary for tax purposes related to some investment changes. He had skimmed through it quickly, trusting that Patricia wouldn't ask him to sign anything that wasn't in both their interests. The realization that he had voluntarily signed away rights to assets he had assumed were jointly owned hit him like a physical blow. He turned to Webb with desperate urgency, but Webb was studying the document with the expression of a lawyer who recognized professionally executed legal work that would be nearly impossible to challenge. Sarah continued her devastating presentation by placing a series of wire transfer documents on the projector. The transfers showed regular monthly payments from Patricia's Swiss accounts to Richard's business accounts, dating back to the early years of their marriage. "Your Honor, these documents show that my client has been providing substantial financial support to her husband's consulting business throughout their marriage. When Mr. Holloway experienced cash flow difficulties in his second and third years of operation, my client provided bridge funding to ensure his business remained viable. The wire transfers were substantial, ranging from $50,000 to $200,000 per month during the early years of Richard's business. Without this funding," Sarah explained, "Holloway Strategic Solutions would have failed within its first 3 years of operation." Richard felt his chest tighten as he processed what was being revealed. The early years of his business had indeed been difficult, with several months when he had struggled to meet payroll and cover operating expenses. During those dark periods, Patricia had quietly mentioned that some of her family money was available if he needed temporary support to get through rough patches. He had accepted her help gratefully, viewing it as a supportive wife using modest family resources to help her husband's business succeed. Now he understood that those family resources were actually sophisticated international investment portfolios, and Patricia's quiet support had represented millions of dollars in funding that had kept his business alive during its most vulnerable period. Veronica watched the wire transfer documents with growing dread as she realized that everything Richard had built, everything she had fallen in love with about his success and wealth, had been funded by the woman she had been planning to replace. Richard's impressive client list, his company's growth, even his reputation in the business community, all of it had been built on Patricia's financial foundation. Sarah placed another series of documents on the projector, these showing property records for Richard's business office building. Once again, Patricia's name appeared as the sole owner, with documentation showing that she had purchased the building in 2019 and leased it back to Richard's company at below-market rates. Your Honor, my client also owns the office building that houses her husband's consulting firm, Sarah announced. Market analysis shows that my client has been subsidizing her husband's business operations by charging approximately 60% of market rate for prime commercial space. The revelation that Patricia owned Richard's office building struck his business associates in the gallery like a thunderbolt. They had always been impressed by Richard's ability to secure such prestigious office space, viewing it as evidence of his business acumen and financial success. Learning that his wife had been subsidizing his rent shattered another pillar of their respect for his entrepreneurial abilities. Webb made a desperate attempt to regain some ground. Your Honor, even if Mrs. Holloway provided some financial assistance early in Mr. Holloway's business development, that doesn't negate the success he achieved through his own efforts and expertise. Sarah Morrison smiled as she placed her next document on the projector. This one showed a detailed financial analysis of Holloway Strategic Solutions, prepared by the same accounting firm that Richard's team had used earlier to demonstrate his success. Your Honor, this analysis shows that when we remove the effects of my client's financial support, Mr. Holloway's business has actually operated at a loss in 7 of the past 10 years. The regular capital infusions from my client's accounts have created the appearance of profitability, but the underlying business model has never been sustainable without external funding. Richard stared at the analysis with the expression of a man watching his entire professional identity collapse. The numbers were undeniable, showing that his impressive revenue figures had been offset by expenses that exceeded income in most years. Without Patricia's quiet financial support, his consulting firm would have failed repeatedly. The courtroom atmosphere had shifted from shock to something approaching awe as observers processed the magnitude of what was being revealed. Patricia had not only maintained her own successful international consulting business while appearing to be a housewife, but she had also single-handedly funded and sustained her husband's business success while allowing him to take all the credit. Patricia stood once again, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. Your Honor, I would like the court to understand that I provided this financial support willingly and without resentment. I believe that my husband's happiness and success were important to our marriage, and I was financially able to provide assistance without hardship. She paused, looking directly at Richard for the first time since the revelations had begun. However, the characterization of our marriage as one where I contributed nothing while benefiting from his success is not just inaccurate, but represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how our household functioned financially. Judge Chun leaned back in her chair, clearly overwhelmed by the complexity of what she was hearing. Ms. Morrison, are you saying that your client has been the primary financial support for both the family's lifestyle and her husband's business throughout their marriage? Yes, Your Honor, that is exactly what I am saying. Sarah placed a final summary document on the projector, showing the total financial flows between Patricia's accounts and their joint expenses over 15 years. The numbers were staggering. Patricia had contributed over $18 million to support their lifestyle and Richard's business, while Richard's net contribution had been negative in most years. The summary showed that Patricia had funded the house purchase, the luxury cars, the country club memberships, the expensive vacations, and even Richard's investment accounts, all while maintaining the appearance of a woman who contributed nothing to the marriage beyond domestic management. Veronica felt physically ill as she absorbed the implications of what she was learning. The wealthy, successful man she had planned to marry was actually financially dependent on the woman she had been helping him mock and dismiss. Every expensive dinner Richard had bought her, Every piece of jewelry he had given her, every promise he had made about their future together, all of it had been funded by Patricia's money. Richard turned to look at Patricia with her expression of complete bewilderment. For 15 years, she had allowed him to believe that he was the financial provider in their marriage, the successful businessman who had built something substantial through his own efforts. She had never corrected his assumptions, never claimed credit for her contributions, never demanded recognition for the role she played in his success. Webb made one final, desperate objection. Your Honor, this entire presentation assumes that these international accounts and business records are legitimate. I request that the court order independent verification of these documents before accepting any of this testimony. Judge Chun considered the request carefully, then turned to Sarah Morrison. Ms. Morrison, can you provide additional verification of these financial records? Certainly, Your Honor. Sarah approached the bench with a thick folder containing what appeared to be federal authentication documents. These records have been verified by the Internal Revenue Service, the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and the Securities and Exchange Commission as part of my client's compliance with federal reporting requirements for international assets. She handed the folder to Judge Chun, who spent several minutes reviewing the federal authentication stamps and verification codes. The documents clearly showed that multiple federal agencies had examined Patricia's financial records and found them to be completely legitimate. Patricia remained standing as Judge Chun reviewed the federal verifications. Your Honor, she said quietly, I want the court to understand that I am not seeking vengeance or attempting to harm my husband financially. I simply want the court to base its decision on accurate information about our marriage's true financial structure. Her words carried a dignity that was impossible to ignore, and even Richard's supporters in the gallery found themselves reassessing everything they thought they knew about the Holloway marriage. The woman they had dismissed as a gold-digging housewife had actually been the financial foundation that supported everything they had admired about Richard's success. Judge Chun closed the federal verification folder and looked across the courtroom with the expression of someone who had just witnessed one of the most dramatic reversals in her judicial career. The case that had begun as a straightforward divorce between a successful businessman and his dependent wife had been revealed as something entirely different, and the final chapter promised to be even more shocking than what had already been disclosed. Judge Chin sat in contemplative silence for what felt like an eternity, reviewing the mountain of documents that had transformed her understanding of the Holloway marriage. The federal verifications lay before her alongside the international banking records, business documents, and property deeds that painted a picture so different from the morning's opening arguments that it seemed like an entirely different case. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of judicial authority mixed with barely concealed amazement at what had been revealed. In my 23 years on the bench, she began, I have rarely encountered a case where the initial presentation of facts was so fundamentally at odds with the underlying reality. The evidence presented by Mrs. Holloway's counsel has been thoroughly verified by multiple federal agencies, and I find no reason to question its authenticity or completeness. Richard sat frozen in his chair, watching his entire world dissolve with each word from the judge. Beside him, Webb looked like a lawyer who had just experienced the most devastating professional humiliation of his career. The case he had believed was an easy victory had become a masterclass in how assumptions could lead to catastrophic miscalculation. Judge Chun continued, her tone becoming more authoritative as she reached her conclusions. The postnuptial agreement executed by both parties in 2020 is legally binding and clearly establishes Mrs. Holloway's separate property rights to her inherited assets and business income. More significantly, the evidence shows that far from being a dependent spouse, Mrs. Holloway has been the primary financial provider for the marital lifestyle and has substantially subsidized her husband's business operations throughout their marriage. Veronica felt her stomach drop as she processed what the judge was saying. Every dream she had built around Richard's wealth, every plan they had made for their future together, all of it was evaporating as the reality of Patricia's financial dominance became clear. Based on the evidence presented, Judge Chun announced, I am ruling as follows. First, all assets identified as Mrs. Holloway's separate property under the postnuptial agreement, including the family residence, the business office building, and all international investment accounts, remained solely under Mrs. Holloway's control. Patricia remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged, as if she had expected this outcome from the beginning. Richard, by contrast, looked like a man watching his life collapse in real time. Second, Judge Chun continued. Given that Mr. Holloway's consulting business has been financially dependent on his wife's ongoing support, and given that Mrs. Holloway owns the building housing the business, I am ordering that Mr. Holloway has 30 days to vacate both the family residence and the business premises. The 30-day timeline hit Richard like a physical blow. Not only was he losing his home, but his business location as well, and without Patricia's financial support, he knew that Holloway Strategic Solutions would not survive the transition. Third, the judge announced, Mr. Holloway is entitled to retain his personal belongings and vehicles that were purchased with joint funds, specifically the 2019 BMW SUV. However, the Mercedes S-Class and Porsche 911 were purchased with funds from Mrs. Holloway's separate accounts and remain her property. Richard closed his eyes as he realized he would be losing not just his home and office, but even the luxury vehicles he had viewed as symbols of his success. Everything that had defined his public image was being systematically stripped away. Judge Chin's next ruling addressed the most painful aspect of Richard's situation. Given the evidence that Mrs. Holloway provided substantial ongoing financial support for her husband's business and lifestyle, and given her significantly greater earning capacity and assets, Mr. Holloway is not entitled to spousal support. Furthermore, he is responsible for his own legal fees in this proceeding. Webb's face went pale as he realized that his substantial legal fees would not be paid by Patricia, as was standard in cases where one spouse had significantly greater resources. Richard would be personally responsible for the hundreds of thousands of dollars his legal team had charged for what turned out to be a spectacularly unsuccessful representation. But Judge Chin was not finished. Most significantly, she continued, the evidence shows that Mr. Holloway has been operating his consulting business using capital provided by Mrs. Holloway under what was presented as temporary support, but which continued for over a decade. Mrs. Holloway is entitled to the return of all capital she provided to support her husband's business, plus reasonable interest. Sarah Morrison stood to address the court. Your Honor, our calculations show that Mrs. Holloway provided approximately $4.2 million in direct business support over the course of the marriage. At standard commercial lending rates, the total amount owed, including interest, would be approximately $6.8 million. Richard felt the blood drain from his face as he processed what he was hearing. Not only was he losing everything he thought he owned, but he was also being ordered to repay millions of dollars that he didn't have and couldn't possibly raise without the business that was about to lose its funding and location. Judge Chin nodded at Sarah's calculation. Mr. Holloway is ordered to repay this amount according to a schedule to be determined in post-judgment proceedings. Given his current financial situation, the court will establish a reasonable payment plan, but the debt remains valid and enforceable. The courtroom erupted in whispers as observers processed the magnitude of Patricia's victory. She had not only retained all her assets, but had essentially bankrupted her ex-husband in the process, all while maintaining a dignified demeanor that had never wavered throughout the proceedings. Veronica stood abruptly and rushed from the courtroom, unable to watch any more of the destruction of the future she had planned. Her relationship with Richard had been built entirely on the wealth and status that was now revealed to have belonged to Patricia all along. Outside in the courthouse corridor, she called her sister and spoke in rapid, panicked sentences about needing to find a new apartment and a new job immediately. Patricia finally stood as Judge Chun prepared to close the proceedings. Your Honor, if I may address the court briefly. Of course, Mrs. Holloway. Patricia's voice carried easily through the stunned courtroom. Your Honor, while I am grateful for the court's ruling, I want to make clear that my goal was never to destroy my husband financially. I simply wanted the truth about our marriage to be understood and our assets to be divided fairly based on actual contributions rather than assumptions. She turned to look directly at Richard for the first time since the judge had begun her ruling. Richard, I genuinely hope you will find success and happiness in your future endeavors. The skills and relationships you have developed are real, even if the financial foundation was different than you believed. Her words carried no malice or satisfaction. only the sadness of someone who had watched a marriage end due to fundamental misunderstandings and deceptions that could have been avoided if honest communication had existed from the beginning. Judge Chin brought down her gavel with finality. This court is adjourned. The divorce of Richard and Patricia Holloway is hereby granted, with property division as I have outlined. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Richard sat alone at the defendant's table, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Webb and his legal team packed their materials quickly, clearly eager to escape the scene of their professional humiliation. The business associates who had come to witness Richard's victory left without speaking to him, their respect and friendship having evaporated along with his apparent wealth. Patricia gathered her simple purse and walked toward the exit with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the proceedings. Her sister Elena embraced her warmly, but Patricia's expression remained thoughtful rather than triumphant. 6 months later, the consequences of that day in courtroom 4B had played out exactly as the evidence had predicted. Richard had been forced to close Holloway Strategic Solutions when he could no longer afford the commercial rent at market rates and lost access to the capital that had kept his business afloat. His former clients had gradually moved their business to competitors, unwilling to work with a consultant whose professional reputation had been so thoroughly demolished. Richard now worked as a senior consultant for a mid-sized firm downtown, earning a solid but unremarkable salary that allowed him to rent a modest apartment and make payments toward the debt he owed Patricia. The work was satisfying enough, and without the pressure of maintaining an expensive lifestyle, he had discovered that he actually enjoyed the consulting work itself more than he had enjoyed running a business. Veronica had disappeared entirely from Richard's social circle within weeks of the court ruling. Her last conversation with him had been a frantic phone call where she accused him of deliberately deceiving her about his financial situation, though she had eventually acknowledged that he had been as surprised as anyone by the revelations about Patricia's wealth. Patricia herself had quietly returned to her international consulting practice, which had grown substantially during the months when she no longer needed to subsidize Richard's business operations. She had moved to a smaller but equally elegant home closer to the city center, where she hosted occasional dinner parties for clients and friends who appreciated her expertise in international finance. Those who had known the Holloways during their marriage often remarked on how much more relaxed and confident Patricia seemed after the divorce. It was as if she had finally been freed from the need to pretend to be less capable and less successful than she actually was. The story of Patricia Holloway's courtroom revelation had spread quickly through legal and business circles, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of making assumptions about people based on surface appearances. Law schools began using the case as an example of how thorough discovery procedures should be conducted, while business schools cited it as a lesson about the importance of understanding the true sources of entrepreneurial success. What are your thoughts on this incredible story of hidden wealth and justice served? Have you ever encountered a situation where someone's true capabilities were completely different from what they appeared to be? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story of Patricia's quiet triumph resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more amazing tales of justice and unexpected revelations. Sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who choose to hide their strength until the perfect moment to reveal it. Richard occasionally wondered what would have happened if he had simply asked Patricia about her background when they first met, or if he had shown genuine interest in her capabilities and experiences during their marriage. The woman he had dismissed as a dependent housewife had actually been one of the most financially sophisticated people he had ever encountered, and his failure to recognize that fact had cost him everything he thought he valued. But in quieter moments, when he was honest with himself, Richard had to admit that Patricia's victory had been earned not just through her financial resources, but through her grace under pressure and her refusal to become bitter despite years of being underestimated and taken for granted. She had shown him what real strength looked like, and while the lesson had been expensive, it was one he would never forget.